Okay, welcome to today's webinar on harnessing the power of data with our special guest, Antony Ugoni. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Katrina Park and I lead the technology practice at 6 Degrees. Before we get started, we acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I also want to acknowledge that it's been a very challenging year for many of you, and we appreciate you taking the time to join us today and hope that you get a lot of value out of the session. Some housekeeping for today's webinar. We are recording the session so that we can then share it online afterwards. During the webinar, you'll be able to use the Q&A function to send through any questions that you'd like Antony to answer at the end of the presentation. So we've turned off the chat function. So if you just use the Q&A function for your questions, we can tackle those at the end. For those of you who aren't familiar with 6 Degrees, we're a specialist recruitment and executive search organisation with a mission that goes beyond connecting the right people with the right role. As well as our passion for delivering the very best talent solutions and bringing career aspirations to life, we are also committed to providing deep market knowledge and insights to help our clients stay up to date with the latest challenges and opportunities facing their sectors. Which brings us to today's topic. Data is a much talked about topic and a key focus for many business leaders. The data analytics revolution is evolving rapidly. I'm sure you've all heard the saying that data is the new oil. In today's digital world, organisations are flooded with data. In the last 2 years alone, 90% of the world's data has been generated, and massive increases in digitalisation are pushing almost all organisations to become highly data-driven. The ability to collect data and analyse data at unprecedented speed and volume means companies are now viewing data differently. Investing in analytical capability is no longer just an option for data-driven organisations. It's mandatory to survive and grow in the ever-competing market. Companies across all industries, from startups to large enterprises, are investing heavily in data analytics to capture, curate, and analyse the data to derive meaningful insights, which will lead to commercial outcomes. We're very fortunate to have Antony Ugoni join us today to share his knowledge and insights on how we can harness the power of data. Beginning his career as a biostatistician to the Alfred Group of Hospitals jointly with Monash Medical School, he then moved to a lecturing and research role in biostatistics at the University of Melbourne. Antony has co-authored more than 50 peer-reviewed articles in medical research and still actively contributes to this industry today. Antony is also the chairman of the IAPA, the Institute of Analytics Professionals of Australia. He's a board member of the AADL, the Australian Alliance for Data Leadership. He's an advisory board member for the Centre of Business Analytics of the Melbourne Business School. He's also worked with NAB, where he led the credit card fraud analytics group, which used data-driven insights to reduce fraud losses by more than 50%. He was then given the opportunity to lead the customer analytics team, which in his tenure identified more than $100 billion worth of revenue opportunities. Antony then joined Seek to build their global AI capability. And by the time he left Seek mid this year, they had 120 staff dedicated to delivering AI services into 10 global markets. And just this year, in the middle of the year, Antony joined Bupa as their Chief Data Officer. Antony's career has been entirely focused on deriving knowledge from data. So it's fair to say that he is very well credentialed to tackle this topic today. I'll hand over to Antony now, and once again, just a reminder to use the Q&A function for questions. Over to you, Antony.
Thank you, Katrina. One of these days, I'm going to get my mum to come into one of these introductions. She still doesn't know what I'm doing. I want to thank everybody for joining today. I'm sorry we're not doing it in person. The dynamic of an in-person presentation is just a little bit richer, but I am enjoying presentations through a virtual world at the moment. We've always joked, for those of you who have mentored individuals around presentations, there's always been the advice that if you're feeling nervous on stage, Just imagine that all the participants in the audience are sitting there in their underwear. And in a virtual world, I can almost guarantee there are going to be a handful of you sitting in inappropriate work gear today. So that at least entertains me while I'm giving the presentation. And if any of you are courageous enough, kind of in the Q&A, to admit to what you're wearing, that'll lighten the mood. I need to apologise in advance. Today's Tuesday. I've done 4 hours of presentations yesterday and another hour this morning, and my voice is slowly breaking for the second time in my life. So if I sound a bit husky and you need me to repeat, just ping Katrina or let us know, and I'll take a sip of water and have another go. It's never been a better time to be alive, to be you know, an analytics nerd. The mathematicians, the computer scientists. There are 3 things that have come together to make data the conversation that it is today. Katrina gave you some stats. This is an outdated stat that I like to throw, but if you took all the information that has been published on the net and published it in book form and stacked the books one on top of the other, you actually get to the moon and back 7.5 times. It's an extraordinary amount of information, but we need to also be quite humble in the sort of data that we're producing and how much data is being put together. We need to understand that 3D printers have been around for millennia, and actually there have been computers that have been taking on enormous amounts of information and producing 3D objects for hundreds of thousands of years. We've never called them 3D printers, we've called them mums, and the rest of society is just kind of catching up with regards to the amount of data that we've taken on board and processing and outputs that we're able to deliver. We've got 3 things going on, and I'm going to just give you the warning that my entire presentation in a virtual world will be meme related. Everybody in the audience today will have been sitting in their offices looking at, you know, what's probably flashy PowerPoint presentations, but after a little while, you just get a little bit too tempted with Amazon and eBay potentially in the background, or an email that pops up. The presentations that I've been most engaged with during the pandemic have been those where I don't know what's coming next. So every slide is a meme of some sort. There are 3 trends that we've been incredibly lucky to be a part of. The first one being internet everywhere. Internet everywhere is a short version of an enormous amount of data being written every millisecond, your own digital exhaust. Our children today have no hesitation in publishing their own data through various social environments. I can't remember the last time I actually had cash in my wallet. The amount of data that I generate through my own retail transactions is enormous. So we've got information being published all over the place persistently, and there simply isn't enough capacity in the workforce to take advantage of all that data. But we have an enormous amount of information available to us. If we were in a room together, I typically ask individuals how many connected devices they have on them. The record so far has been 7 connected devices. There was a guy who had 2 personal phones and 2 work phones. My immediate question to him in front of the rest of the audience was, does your wife know that you have 2 personal phones? But we won't query his motivations. The second trend that has made the data science fraternity unbelievably attractive has been the emergence of cloud. Cloud gives us a number of things. It gives us enormous compute, and it gives us the ability to store data. I'm old enough now to remember being at a graduation ceremony, my own graduation ceremony, for my master's degree, where I sat in the Union Hall of a university. Now universities typically book out sports stadiums, but I was in the Union Hall, and the number of people graduating at master's level and above with stats or applied mathematics, there were 4 of us in that graduation ceremony. And the number of people from the computer science teams who were graduating at master's level and above, so just excluding all of the graduate, the bachelor's level graduates, master's level and above, there were 200 people graduating in database type capability. So, you know, a couple of decades ago, there were 200 people figuring out how to store data and only 4 people figuring out how to take advantage of that data. But those 200 people have gone on to build us an unbelievable ecosystem of compute storage and compute power. The algorithms that you hear of today, the neural networks, convolutional neural networks, the TreeNet type examples, those have been known to the mathematical world for the best part of 30, 40, 50 years in some cases. The inability to actually find anything, find any computer that could actually crunch that data was very limited. So typically there were Cray computers lying around in bureaus of meteorology and government institutions, but the ability to get access to those in a corporate environment or even in your own home and a play environment was simply non-existent. So the work that we've done in the analytics industry from the mid-80s to possibly the early to mid-2000s was all the low-hanging fruit, was all the elegant mathematical work that you could do almost by hand. In fact, so some of those algorithms stats and math students would actually do by hand in exams, and you didn't need enormous compute power. The neural nets of the world require enormous computational memory in order to fit these models, and Amazon and their competitors have given us that ability to spin up nodes and have that computing power. And the typical problems that you work on that require those sorts of algorithms have what we call a lot of noise in the data. So the requirement to apply models to unbelievably noisy data to find the signals that you never typically anticipate might be in there require huge volumes of data. So cloud has given us that ability to store that data and to crunch those algorithms. The third trend that's emerged, and I spoke briefly to it earlier on, is the attitudes to privacy. So we still, as an industry, take security and privacy unbelievably seriously. It's probably the highest investment, IT investment in most organisations, securing data. However, consumers have moved from a conversation which has been dominant on privacy and Big Brother type of attitudes towards now a conversation that says, I give you an organisation, I give you access to all my data, I give you the privilege of seeing all my data. My expectation is that you deliver back to me value and efficiency. And while this is a trend that we're seeing in the marketplace, in consumers, I think we all know that organisations are not leveraging that emerging attitude and delivering all the value that we could be bringing to consumers. But our consumers are screaming out for better services, better products. If you spend any time with your market research folk, I'll almost guarantee you in the top 5 things, top 5 issues that individuals portray in those surveys is, you treat me like you don't know me. I'd encourage you to go through the experience at any of our banks, not just the top 4, but any of our banks in Australia, where you've been a customer for a long period of time. Go through a lending application for a couple of $100,000 and look at all the paperwork that you need to go through. asking for information that the bank should actually know. Given all the transactions that you put through that organisation, they'll see your history of pay, you still get a service that is by and large treating you as though you might be a new customer. So, for those of you who've had CEOs who have read Fast Company and have been in the chairman's lounge of various airports, there was a wave of recruitment 5 to 10 years ago where the prevailing attitude was, we just need to get good data scientists and everything will be okay. And the reality, of course, is that's not going to happen. If you take on board a bunch of highly capable data individuals and give them access to your data, their instinct would be to do really cool things with the data. And oftentimes they'll generate value for the organisation, not through strategy, but almost by accident. And organisations for the longest time haven't been able to harness the full power of their analytics community to get the best and most value out of them. And when I talk about analytics community, I'm not just talking about data scientists. I'm talking about data scientists, your BI specialists, analysts, but then there are other functions that align with those analytics functions that make, that force the value to come from those endeavours. And those are your change and communications consultants. The most important recruitment that we did while I was at looking after customer analytics at NAB were 5 former bankers who we got to sit down with our data scientists to understand what they were doing, how they were doing it, what their limitations were. Then they would spend the best part of a year traveling all over Australia, talking to bankers about the work that my team was doing, but in banker language. And the success on the back of just having the right communication forced me to bring in a consultancy to check the reporting of my own team, because I actually didn't believe the results of the leads and their performance once we got them out into field in a language that the bankers understood. So change in communication, crucial to a data science team. Strategy, having strategy folk aligned with the data science team is unbelievably important because those are the people who give you context around what you're doing, why you're doing it, where the value is to be had. And they can also take back to the organisation all those rich conversations that say, while we're working on this problem, did you realise that there are these other things, these other pockets of insight that we can uncover for you? And those strategy people are really good at identifying ways to link all that work together from analytics into business value. And then, of course, you need those fantastic data engineers and technologists to create the data flows both into your data environments for analysis and then outputs into the field, either through leads or experiences on your digital channels or even through dashboards for the business to then take advantage of internally. So having the data scientists there alone is clearly not enough. The presentation that I'm about to go through now for the remainder is, I have another part to this presentation, and this is telling data scientists, analysts, all those technical people what they do wrong and what they need to do better to get value out of organisations. So I just wanted to make sure I landed that particular note with you so that you don't feel that the conversation I'm about to have now suggests that the fault of not getting value out of data is entirely on the rest of the business. The analytics community and the non-analytics community all have a part to play. So the blockers to value, so I've already mentioned earlier, is strategy. I'm spending a lot of my time at Bupa talking to people about a data strategy. And some of the leading questions as we talk about the data strategy suggests that this is a strategy onto itself. What I typically coach individuals in the analytics sphere to understand is your data strategy is a subsection of the business strategy. So your role as leaders in an organisation is to understand the role that you play in making that strategy come to life, so that the analytics community can take advantage of that strategy. I've got a number of examples where I've had staff do amazing pieces of work that has been diametrically opposed to the strategy. So it's been amazing work that's gone nowhere. Just to bring one of those to life, one of my staff members had a bunch of spare time available, and we've been pushing our staff members to come back to the business with here's the insight that you never asked for, that we think would create enormous value. And I'd actually been on annual leave, had come back, and this particular staff member had done what still today for me is one of the richest, the most impressive pieces of analysis on a data set within the retail banking sector at NAB. He had identified a whole bunch of deposit opportunities, customers who had hidden cash reserves lying around the various banking environments within Australia. Was there an opportunity to attract that funding back into National Australia Bank? It was a great piece of work, and what he'd completely missed at that particular time was that the organisation was actually flushed with funds. And while we were still very much open to the notion of going out and attracting deposit funds into the organisation, the reality was the market was chasing lending, and we needed to be there as a major lender in the industry. But more so, we had more than enough capital reserves to take on a larger portfolio of lending than we had for a long time. And so most of the organisation was getting behind the lending strategy, and this particular individual had done a piece of work that supported a deposit strategy. So when I talk about diametrically opposed, this was completely at odds with what the rest of the organisation was trying to do. So making sure that your analytics community have access to the strategy, and not access to the PowerPoint decks, but access to the individuals who have written those decks, but more importantly, giving them access to the front line who help build out the evidence for that strategy. Get your analytics professionals, regardless of the industry that you're in, get them to be spending a day, not in 2020, but beyond 2020, have them spend time with your branch manager, have them spend time in your call center. Make sure they get the opportunity, if you work in FMCG, give them the opportunity to work in one of your big box stores or in the logistics and distributions environments. It gives them a very solid grounding on a number of fronts. First of all, it brings them a little bit of humility, because we've been told for the longest time how clever we are because we pursue mathematics and those disciplines as a career. So it gives us a little bit of humility around not being the center of the universe, but it also gives context to the problems that we're trying to solve and the strategy is focused on. You need to have an appreciation of the data that we are dealing with. So, what's the holdup? I can't believe it's taking this long to do this analysis. Surely you have all the data, is something that I've heard for the longest time. So just a little bit of appreciation that where we get data is not from an environment that has been built to provide data for data science purposes. The data that we typically take advantage of is data that's built to support a frontline system. It's built to support a transaction, a search. It's been built to run an autonomous vehicle, for example. And where we have the opportunity, we will repurpose that data. You need to understand that we're repurposing that data to answer questions that the organisation has asked. So to give you two examples, you can run your own test within your own organisations. I encourage you to go back to 2 or 3 of your analytics teams and do this separately and ask them this simple question. Ask them, how many customers do we have? And see how many different answers come back to you. I know that going back to my banking example, with my own personal banking, I'm a customer at National Australia Bank. My wife is a customer with National Australia Bank from the perspective of being a secondary on a credit card. The issue with being a secondary on a credit card is only one person has responsibility for the lending on that card. And so my wife has access to the funds on that card, but no responsibility for the credit. So does that make her a customer? My financial planner has read access to all of my accounts, as does my accountant. But they actually do all their personal banking elsewhere. So the fact that they've got my wife, my financial planner, my accountant, have all had to go through the 100-point check and have got a unique customer number at National Australia Bank, does that make them a customer of the organisation? So there are definitions in the data that that you need to be aware of that makes not all data equal. Another great example is there are some technologies, a little bit outdated now, but some search technologies that in order to make the search faster would present to the corpus a whole bunch of micro searches. So this is not what would happen at Seek when I was there. We used a little bit more modern capability, but if I just use Seek as a hypothetical example, if you're looking for a role as a data scientist, you would start typing DA, and the system would then say, right, this person's running a query. We have a large number of job ads in the corpus. We don't want to wait right to the end of the search to search through all 150-odd thousand ads. How can we reduce the number of ads in the meantime such that the search right at the end of Antony's search is as quick as possible? So I'd start typing DA, and the search engine would do a search on all the ads that matched DA. And of course, 90% of the ads would come back. And then I type TA space. And so the 90% now that remained would have the search data applied to that 90%. That might reduce the corpus down to 45%. Then I'd start typing SCIE, and the query would then go off and run on the now 45% of the 90% and reduce the corpus again. And then right at the end of that query, I'd hit return on data scientist, and the query would run on a much smaller corpus of the inventory, so that the search would come back lickety split and it'd be a great customer experience. Unfortunately, what happens in the background is the DA search, the DATA space search, the DATA space SCI search, all register as individual searches. And so the very simple question, which might be how many searches do we have per day, actually turns out to be quite a complex problem. And so right throughout your systems, you'll find filthy data throughout the organisation. The very final example that I'll give you, my first role at NAB was looking after credit card fraud. We had systems in place, real-time systems in place, such that your transaction might alert to one of our rules, and we would be able to make phone calls to customers while they were still sitting there at the POS device, having not yet received the goods, where they'd get a call that says, I just want to let you know, this is Anthony from NAB. We've seen this transaction. We think it may be fraudulent. And you would respond with, actually, no, it's a genuine transaction. And by the way, I'm still here at the counter. In able to do the real-time work, you need to trade off dirty data for real-time. In another part of the organisation at NAB, we would have individuals looking at credit scoring, so looking at individuals and understanding whether or not they were worthy of paying back, that $1 million loan. If you're going to make decisions on whether or not people are creditworthy, you need to make sure that data is pristine. And so everywhere from really dirty real-time data to clean, pristine data for quite tricky decisioning, data comes in every form in between. And so, sorry, family's just turned up. I'm just going to close the door. That was bad planning, Katrina. The perils of working from home. So your data you need to understand that just because the data is flowing doesn't necessarily mean the data is available. Experimentation is incredibly important. Your data community, what they lack is they lack a whole bunch of context, even though you may in the strategy have given a deep context on the problem that you're trying to solve. There's context in the data to begin with. One of those will be your frontline systems will be using the fields that you've quite clearly defined. They may be gender, product type, reason codes for out of certain conversations. Your frontline staff need to get through the servicing of their customers, and oftentimes our systems aren't necessarily fit for purpose, and so they'll repurpose those systems. So it's really important when your data scientists utilize the data that's at hand and believe the titles and the definitions of the data that's made available to them. When they build these models and they put them into field, is that data performing in the way that you intended it to perform in either the very simple trigger that you've built or the black box model that you've built? Put that model into field and just run the experiment. Calling out the need here for really strong statistical expertise to design the experiment well, but just getting that particular object in front of your customers in just a small slice, 5%, 10%, whatever your risk appetite might be, and just monitoring that particular piece of work to understand if it's doing what you intended. The next most important thing in the experimentation space, though, is once you have something in field and it is working, having the humility to understand that it's probably not maxing out, that it probably could be better. And so what are the things that you're doing to understand those champions and challenges such that you're just trying to make that model or that offer or the way you've designed your web page, whatever it is, how are you putting things in place such that you can constantly make things better. A fantastic quote from an eBay presentation I attended a number of years back is that 100% of customers when customers come to the platform, 100% of customers are in at least one experiment 100% of the time. So every time you go to eBay, there is something about your experience on that particular platform that is an experiment. It's either the search algorithm that they're using to serve up the results that you're looking at. It's the way they've built the features, the filters, where they put a button, even the coloring of the page. Something in there is an experiment, and you are part of an experiment while they're consistently trying to improve that page. So you need to have a rich appetite for experimentation. This is something that every analyst, maybe in this presentation, will have experienced, and that is, the very important executive walking down the corridor and saying, "Hey, listen, I just said this thing to a very large audience. Can you go and find some data that backs up this thing that I've said?" This is a real waste of your analytics professionals. Your analytics professionals come with, for the most part, no bias towards any particular way that the data will be talking and messaging the signals that your customers, your consumers, or your machines are behaving. They simply want to let the data talk. So one way that you can drive engagement down in your analytics community is to torture the data until it confesses to crimes that it was never a part of. So that open mind to say, there is this problem, I need to understand what the data tells me as a lead or a hypothesis to kind of run down and try to figure out that problem. In the bookcase behind me, I should have pulled it down, there is a great book which is called Fooled by Randomness, and it speaks to the C-suite that is falling away behind us, who weren't really data-driven in their approach to their careers simply because the data wasn't available. And so that gut feel, instinctive C-level individual is now becoming a thing of the past, and the more data-driven version is emerging. But those immediate reactions to a question and then hoping that the data backs you up is a thing of the past. Probabilities don't equal guarantees. I'd be really keen in the Q&A if anybody can tell me who this particular person is. If there's any data scientist or engineer, etc., who don't know who this person is, we need to put this on your development plan. But very famous author, Douglas Adams, created this particular character, could do unbelievable computation in short periods of times and punch out probabilities on almost any question. Your analytics community are going to give you pieces of insight that come with probability. That means we're never wrong, which is a nice place to be. The probability that this particular customer takes a home loan is 40%. So, you know, take the phone call, have the conversation, and if they don't have the desire to take out the home loan, well, there was always a 60% chance that they wouldn't. A lot of times we'll talk to the humans on the ends of these leads, and they'll say, you know, I don't like using this particular piece of insight because I've had too many experiences where you've told me that this customer does have a propensity to do a particular thing, but turns out that they didn't. And that's okay. What we're trying to do in the world of propensity modeling is we're simply trying to outdo what the humans typically do. Now, disingenuous humans make random phone calls. And I can guarantee that any data scientist worth their salt will be able to outdo randomness as a strategy. So we're trying to do a bit better than randomness, but we're also trying to do a bit better than good instinctual kind of conversation identification. Somebody who's been in an industry for a long period of time, they will call it gut instinct, but the reality is they will look at a particular customer profile. I'm mixing my careers here. They'll look at a particular customer profile, see a bunch of information on screen and say, look, I think this particular individual is probably up for the chat for the home loan. The reality is that experienced salesperson isn't having an instinctual reaction to that screenshot. They're actually their own data scientists, their own neural network. They're seeing things on screen that are pointers to positive conversations. And what the data scientists are trying to do is they're trying to capture all of that experience and build it at scale. And while, you know, Antony as an experienced banker might see 2 or 3 features, Katrina as an experienced banker might see 3 or 4 other features, what the models will be doing is they'll be finding all of those features in what's unfortunately still today a bit of a hidden way and mashing them together to give you those probabilities. So the last thing I'll leave you with on this particular conversation, and this is not just on insight generating leads, but this is for almost any pursuit. We're looking at black box technologies as a means to an end. We hold these technologies at a far higher standard than we hold the humans. And the best example of that is every time an autonomous vehicle has an accident, it makes front page news. Every time a human being has an accident, it doesn't register a mention. And the scale of human faulted accidents versus autonomous vehicle faulted accidents, they are just not in balance. So understand that what we're building are probabilities that will almost always beat a human performance. How am I going for time, Katrina? Oh, I'm right on time. I'll quickly rush through these, right? Love the sound of my own voice. You need to treat data as an asset. Data is probably the most valuable asset that you have available to you today. So you need to build mechanisms to govern and catalog and make it easy for your practitioners to trawl through that data. You need to make sure that you're using your data scientists to create value. The number of times I would have an executive in the background saying, Anthony, that's a great piece of analysis. Could you just cut it by state? Could you just cut it by channel? Could you just cut it by industry? It's a very easy question to ask. Sometimes those very easy questions to ask generate enormous amounts of work. And the reality is the only value that you get out of that is you look like the smartest person in the room because you've just quoted one particular number nobody else had. Understand that the different disciplines in the analytics sphere are all different. Your data scientist is not your BI specialist. Your BI specialist is not your analytics specialist. These are all separate entities within your data science and analytics communities. Your HR specialist is not your recruitment specialist in your wider HR function. And so the same exists in the analytics sphere. Come to us with the problem, not a solution. So oftentimes I've had executives come to us and say, Anthony, we really need you to build a Bayesian naive classifier. The question is, why do you need that? Well, I just read a Google paper and they've got one. Come to us with the problem and then we'll work with you on what the right solution is in context of your organisation's data and the capacity to absorb the insight that gets developed. And finally, leadership. Leadership is key. Find out what are the mechanisms such that your data scientists, analysts, BI specialists, and the rest of the community have a career pathway. If they are all managed by a mid-level management group who don't have any technical expertise, then you've put a very, very short ceiling on your analytics community and their progress through your organisation. So ask yourself the question, do you have the CAOs, the CDOs, where they can rally around and have a pathway, a career pathway? But more importantly, analytics professionals are very black and white in their conversations. I often joke that two analysts will get together and disagree on something. They'll go to the whiteboard, they'll draw up the left-hand side of the equation, they'll work down the right-hand side of the equation, and one will turn to the other and say, hey, I was wrong and you were right. And business is not like that. Business is full of politics and bureaucracy, and our DNA is just not equipped to kind of champion our cause in those organisations. So you really need to make sure that they have a respected leader who is very data-driven, very analytically capable, who can push that cause right up to the top. So I'll pause there. My voice lasted. It changed right throughout. Katrina, are there any questions?
Thank you, Anthony, for that fantastic presentation. I did wonder if that meme of the elderly lady was all of us coming out of 2020. But in terms of questions, are you able to talk a little bit more about ethics in managing data and bias involved?
Yeah, absolutely. The 20 odd years ago, we were a very primitive industry with regards to creating value for organisations. For the most part, it was cross-sell, and it was on very limited information that we had at the time. Obviously, there was also credit risk and credit scoring, but by and large, the ethics of the data that we had and the way we used it wasn't a deep consideration. I mentioned before, we now have access to more data than ever, and the data that we are typically using is what I refer to as naturally occurring data. So it's data that occurs on our transactional systems, in our back-end decisioning tools that, for example, hirers will see resumes, they'll shortlist individuals. There are organisations who take that information and try to understand, is there a way that I can use all of these resumes and all of these ads to understand in a data-driven way who might get shortlisted. We need to understand if that data is occurring in a natural environment, your resume has a whole bunch of hidden information that we don't want the algorithms to learn. So for example, if you've been to, in the US, they'll have universities that say something Catholic university. Well, is that appointed to your religious affiliation? or you may be the treasurer of the University of Melbourne's men's hockey club. Well, that's probably going to go to a male. So, that piece of information in the CV talks to gender. Prefixes on phone numbers will talk to their culture or their race. So what we want to make sure is that the algorithms aren't learning hidden features that exist in the data, in this particular example, age, race, gender. And as an industry, we know that the recruitment industry, everybody on this call excluded, of course, is a reflection of society in general. And what do we know about society? We know society is ageist. We know society is racist. We know society has gender bias. And we need to make sure that the data that we use and the way we use it doesn't learn the behaviours that we prefer to leave behind from our human naturally occurring behaviour. So putting mechanisms in place to eliminate as much of the information that might cause bias is hugely important, and having mechanisms in place to then test those products once you've developed them, to understand, does this particular product work equally for males and females, for old versus young, for Australian citizens versus non. An enormous amount of work needs to go in there, and it's the information that we have access to today and the problems that we're trying to solve makes it a trickier world than we ever have. So most organisations are putting focus on having individuals and or teams 24/7, I shouldn't say 24/7, 5/8, focused on the ethics and bias of the systems they're putting in place.
Thanks, Anthony. What about with regards to the C-suite? You mentioned earlier that the C-suite becoming more data-driven versus gut feel. From what you've experienced and how you've seen that play out with the culture within the business, moving to a more data-driven business, what would you recommend in terms of how the business can move to a more data-driven business, given there are so many in the business that perhaps aren't data orientated? How do you get the C-suite on board and get that executive support? What would you recommend?
Yeah, it sounds easy. It's harder to do. Coming to conversations with, hey, did you know, pieces of insights, I often find anticipating that there may be a claim staked in the conversation quite early by those senior individuals that will then could be a struggle for them to back out of. I'll try to anticipate that those questions or those statements are coming and start the conversation with a statement along the lines of, can we agree that sales in Adelaide are tanking at the moment? Yeah, absolutely, we can agree that. Okay, well, if we can agree that, we've thrown a whole bunch of stuff at the data that we have in Adelaide, compared it to the rest of Australia, and without any bias or any preconceived ideas, I just want to let you know the data suggests these things. Now, the data can be wrong, and the analysis can be wrong, and that's okay. But let's open up a debate around debate around fact. And so I often find that if you get the conversation started on the data and the analytics, we can always have a debate around, the data was dirty, or you collected it from the wrong period of time, or whatever it might be. That analysis is probably not appropriate for this particular problem. Those are factual conversations. So yeah, getting in early is fundamental before, nobody likes painting themselves into a corner and then being faced with a whole bunch of propeller heads who, quite honestly, have never had that career of being on the shop floor, standing in front of a customer, building the widgets. We've only ever really been head office type individuals. So when you get that C-suite person who has come from the ground up, who has got, I spoke about that book, Fooled by Randomness. Hopefully nobody thinks that I think that these individuals are making random statements, but they are making statements based on some experience, and sometimes that experience is maybe out of date, or it doesn't have the full contextual picture that the data might have. Yeah, so jumping on board early with the data into the conversation, I've found has been the number one thing to soften the conversation.
Good advice. Thanks, Antony. With so much data available to consume and analyse, what are some of the best practices that you would recommend to make sure you're making the most of your data and not getting overwhelmed by it?
Yeah, so I never, and my teams have never started from the data. Let's just acknowledge that there's a truckload of data, and that's both in depth and width. So you have a huge number of transactions, but you might have a wide array of source systems from where to get data. Your data scientists won't be overwhelmed by the volume of data, because the work that you do to build a model on 10 observations versus the work that you do to build that same model on 10 million observations is broadly the same work. You just need a little bit more computing time and a little bit more waiting time while the model gets built. Start with the problem. What's the biggest business problem? Never start with the data, both from a what could I do with the data, or I'm worried there's so much data. What is the problem that the business is trying to solve? What is the thing that everybody's trying to get behind? What is the biggest KPI of the CEO? And start there, and then figure out on a whiteboard, not on a keyboard, what's the solution that we can bring to bear. And then once you've done that work, it really is just a coding exercise. Data volume agnostic.
Yep. No, that sounds good. What about, I guess, the perception that, and how have you responded to this perception that AI and machine learning perhaps negates the need for analysts and data scientists? What are your view on that?
I as the leader of groups of data scientists and analysts, and everything that comes with a leader, some days you wish for the day that the robots will finally take over. The AI, the methodologies, the automation of insight, for me, is nothing to be feared in terms of the humans who do the work. The real value in any analytic solution doesn't come from the algorithm being applied to the model. Sorry, the algorithm being applied to the data. The real value comes from the conversation with the business about the problem. All the really easy things, they have already been solved. Most mature organizations are trying to solve really hard problems, and the data is less fit for purpose than it ever has been before. So it really is on the humans to figure out what are the proxies in the data, how can I transform this data to make it look like something that might answer the question that the organization is trying to answer. And then once the model is built, it really is on a human, not a machine, to figure out what's the best way we can use this particular piece of insight. That's not a machine-driven approach. Organizations are automating models, that's true, but the real richness comes in the conversation around the problem and then the utilization, and those are still very much human endeavors.
Thank you, Antony. We look like we've got time for one or two more questions. What has been, in your experience, the reaction of the CXO when a decision has been made that's been based on data, but it wasn't successful when it didn't work? What was the reaction from the customer experience officer?
Yeah, so look, for the most part, they're really mature conversations, and I like to think that these conversations happen at every level. The conversation is typically around what did we know at the time that we made the decision? What was all the information that we had to hand? And would we have made the same decision? So it actually helps that any decision made on the basis of data and on the basis of any modelling is a factual kind of conversation. Oftentimes what you'll see is the insights. I'm not in that industry at the moment, but in a world where we've just gone through a recession and we may be bouncing back a little bit quicker, I'm not entirely sure that the behaviour of consumers in banking, for example, of 2019, 18 and 17 might necessarily be predictive of what we see late 2020, 2021. But in the absence of any other data, what do we know about the data that we're building the models on? How might we adjust that for the experience of a pandemic world? And then what are the objective decisions that we make? And what I found at the C-level and general manager level, et cetera, has been, would we have made a different decision, and what can we learn from it?
Yep, good advice. Well, I think there's lots of valuable insights and takeaways there for people to take back to their own businesses. So thank you so much, Antony, for your time today and all of the valuable pearls of wisdom that you've shared with us. Thank you. And I hope everyone on the webinar has some practical learnings that they can take away to help them operationalise data to create value within your respective organisations. I certainly found it interesting when you talked about some of the blockers to value and obviously data strategy being a subsection of a business strategy. I thought that was quite interesting and very relevant. And I think too, some good advice and suggestions there, Antony, around organisations getting their analytics professionals in the trenches and deep in the business and having that rich appetite for experimentation. So thank you again, really appreciate your time today. If there's any questions we didn't get to, or if anyone has any follow-up questions for Antony, please direct them through to us. And of course, if anyone would like more information on 6 Degrees and how we can support you with your talent needs, please reach out. We're always keen to get feedback and suggestions on topics for other events. So if you have any, please shoot them through. We will follow up with a short survey on email after today's session. Thanks again. Thanks everyone for joining us. Thank you again, Antony. Much appreciated. Your voice did hold up, so well done. And I hope everyone has a wonderful day and week ahead. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Katrina.